we started to really invest ourselves as military services in diversity, inclusion, and equity trainings.
Yep.
Carol Swain, who's a Black female academic, well-respected, except for the last year and left circles, but very well-respected former Vanderbilt, I think, law professor, political science professor. She recently said in an interview that she thought that the diversity, inclusion, and equity industry was one of the greatest threats our country's facing. And that seems just like, it seems like hyperbole, but I don't think it is.
It's exactly right. Sure.
And the reason that's true is because our diversity, inclusion, and equity industry and the trainings we're receiving in the military via that industry are rooted in critical race theory, which is rooted in Marxism. And the language of the training, which most people don't understand, but I hope laid out in the book, was devised by Marxists.
Yeah.
The terminology, the vocabulary, the redefinition of terms, even some terms that Americans hold very near and dear to their hearts, like freedom and equality, for example. Those have been redefined, usurped, and then used to abuse fellow Americans and to create divisions within society, hoping ultimately for, you could call it class conflict, you could call it group identity politic conflict. It's intended to be divisive, and yet we spread it about the military services, pretending like it's going to unify everyone.
Do you think that most of the upper leadership knows about? I mean, you've got guys who are obviously in on the game, but then you've got, flag rank officers who are promoting this stuff, but I'm not sure they all understand what they're promoting. I mean, do you agree with that?
I agree with that. I make it very clear in my work that I try and give people the benefit of the doubt. My book isn't about persons or people that I'm trying to get in trouble or anything like that. It's about ideas. And it just so happens that people are involved in the spreading of those ideas. My sense is that all of my interactions with senior leaders, for example, in the Air Force and in the Space Force have been very positive. We've got very good leaders. They care a great deal about their people. They care a great deal about the lethality of our force. But especially because of the climate at the moment, people that sense that something is off with all of the diversity and inclusion trainings and the language and the coerced speech and this kind of stuff, they're unwilling, I think, and perhaps because they don't understand it, they're unwilling to take a stand against it because they fear perhaps that they might be in the wrong.
Or they might not get promoted.
Or they might not get promoted. That's exactly right. And
well, don't you think it's time for the excuses to go away at this point, though? Because now we're talking about an existential threat to the United States.
I agree with that, too. It is an existential threat. We spend a lot of our time talking about great power competition. That's in the national security strategy, national defense strategy, and rightly so. We're a great power, and other powers like China and Russia are on the, they're on the rise. And but we face our greatest threat here at home at the moment.
The reason we take an oath against domestic enemies,
you'll notice.
The founders.
You'll notice, Todd.
Yeah.
I was recently asked to provide extremism down day training in my unit. Every unit in the Department of Defense was asked to do this. I think it was a 70-page booklet that I received in the Department of the Air Force that gave us talking points to present to our service members.
Yeah. The
context in which the discussion on extremism within the ranks was teed up began with a vignette about January 6, 2021, at the Capitol, of course, right? Well, then that context painted the entire discussion and all the talking points. All of the examples that were given in that 70-page booklet had to do with not last year, 2020, and the destruction of cities and people's civil liberties.
Right.
The talking points had to do with various odd examples of white nationalists that have been caught at some point in the last decade and punished for it and kicked out of the military.
Right.
Or a radical Islamic terrorist, for example, that opens fire on people. But the most radical forms of extremism that we're seeing in our country and in services have nothing to do with the examples that they gave, in fact.
Of course.
And so
There's an
Now,
agenda behind
fortunately,
it all.
from
Yeah.
what I'm sorry, I
There's
interrupted
an
you.
agenda behind it all. I mean, this is where there was an agenda behind this stand down day, obviously.
There is, and so what I don't do is to accuse senior leaders. Some of them are public figures, and so I mention
Yeah.
them by name. The Secretary of Defense, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I don't accuse people of ill motive
Mm-hmm.
because I can't possibly know people's motive. Although
Right.
at the moment, the diversity and inclusion industry is all about punishing people for their implicit and unconscious biases, as if we can be judged by biases that we ourselves can't even perceive that we have. It's a
Right.
completely unfair standard, and yeah, there's an agenda behind that too. But I bring up that agenda that you're referring to. I refer to the Secretary of Defense, his policies, the way he's trying to go about extremism in the book, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I don't demonize the man, but I want to make it clear to both him and every service member that if we pursue this agenda, it will divide us. It will not unify us.
Yeah.
And so to your question was that, do senior leaders or other service members who are in charge pushing these policies understand exactly what they're doing? I hope not.
Yeah.
I think some do, but I couldn't tell you exactly who they are. All I know is that people tend to try to be compassionate. They try to give people equal opportunity, and that's morphing very rapidly into status quos and equal outcomes that
Right.
necessitate forced inequality.
And lack of unit cohesiveness, lack of military effectiveness, lack of lethality, lack of strategy. I mean, go down the list. When you're worried about this, you're not worried about what's really important, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, for years, the Air Force has been trying to fix a fighter pilot shortage.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that it does that is it pays people a lot of money to stick around.
Mm-hmm.
And in my view, I can offer my view on
Mm-hmm.
some of these initiatives. I'll say that those who want to stick around will take the money and stay, and those who don't, it was never about the money in the first place, and they get out. But in the midst of a pilot shortage, we have the nerve as a Pentagon spokesperson, for example, or public affairs official, to say that we have too many white pilots.
Yeah.
That was just said last month. If you want to provide that kind of messaging to your already struggling pilot force, you can expect to see further retention problems.
Of course.
And my sense is that I don't care. I'll make it clear. I don't care what the politics of my service members are.
Right.
They can be Democrats, Republicans. It doesn't matter to me.
Right.
I have my own views. I respect their views. They're welcome to participate in the political process. But when senior leaders begin to politicize the institution itself, that's not what the American people expect, and it's not our obligation. And
Yeah.
the young service members come in out of high school sometimes into the services expecting to do a thing in defense of their country, wearing the uniform, and they're met with what I'll call a hyper-politicized work environment where diversity and inclusion initiatives are being pushed constantly. In fact, the one at my base, we read a book called So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo.
Mm-hmm.
There are suggestions in there about how the reader ought to be donating their free money, which politicians they ought to be supporting,
Yeah.
which social justice initiatives they ought to be supporting, and the United States is referred to as a white supremacist nation all throughout the entire work. And it has no place in the military whatsoever.
Yeah. When I was in,
yeah.
we're a couple decades apart, but nobody cared what
Right.
color skin was. All we cared about is, did you have my back when I needed it? That was it. And I talked to a young enlisted person in the U.S. Air Force recently, and I asked him about, a lot of this racist stuff that's flowing through, and he said, "Well, it's okay because the Air Force leadership agrees with it." And so, yeah, there's an effect, a consequence of what you're talking about.
That's right. Now, I'd like to think that those who lead the services, the highest ranking members, have some pull or sway in affecting whether or not this kind of toxic, poisonous rhetoric continues to affect their service. But
Yeah.
I'm not sure that they have much pull or sway at the moment. They can disagree once.
Yeah.
Yeah, they can disagree twice, and then they're likely to not disagree again.
Yeah, sure.
And so as I contemplate that dilemma and understanding I think, quite well where this leads if we don't knock it off,
Mm-hmm.
because we saw it all throughout the 20th century. Um, I feel like, well, who better to write a book about this from within the services or to talk about it than someone who's active duty, who sees it at the ground level, what it's doing, without revealing, the identities of the people involved. I try and be very explicit in how I describe how this is impacting our culture as a military. And I'll tell you at the moment, because in recent American history, neo-Marxist thought has found a welcome home in the Democrat Party, I'll put it that way, or in left domestic politics. What you see happening in the U.S. military at the moment is that if you're a conservative, then you're lumped into a group of people who are labeled extremists, if you're willing to voice your views. And if you're aligned with the left, then it's okay to be an activist online because no one's going to hold you accountable.